So there's been a lot of discussion about the rise of AI and the impact that's had on our culture, but more importantly, fears relating to AI in the future. One of the fears of AI is going to be the control that robots with laser eyes are going to exert over human beings. But actually, I think one of the places where we can see the greatest concern with AI is right here, hiding in plain sight, in the way in which social media has itself changed the way that human beings interface with one another in real life. The goal of building platforms like Twitter or like Facebook was to take the kinds of conversations that we had in the offline world and to enable them to connect people in the online world who weren't sitting across the table from each other. Well, actually, with the algorithmic force that allowed those business models to achieve network effect and scale, what they were doing was actually preying on human psychic insecurities, on human frailties that caused us to click on something more quickly than not, understanding what that was that made us click more quickly, and then tell the person who spoke the words what caused thousands of other people, or in some cases millions of other people, to react to what one said. And what ended up happening was actually in reverse. That changed the way that human beings in the offline world began interacting with themselves in the offline world instead of the other way around. And I think that's one of the greatest products of AI is indeed the way we as human beings have been programmed by AI to communicate with one another, even in the world outside of the internet that was supposed to replicate and facilitate what we were doing in the offline world in the first place. So it's actually one big jumble if you think about it. But anyway, I think one of our ways out of that, we're not going to regulate our way out of that. I think one of the ways out of that is just being conscious of that reality. There's something about recognizing that, you know what, the way that I'm speaking today to my neighbor, my colleague, my mom, a guy I'm arguing with on the street, is actually informed in some way by the interactions that I have on the internet, which were supposed to be replicating the way that I actually communicated in my real life. I think being conscious of that alone, I think, creates the possibility of liberation. And so one of the things I've been intentional about, it's part of why we're doing this podcast, is to have conversations, preferably in the flesh, in the real world, hopefully unshackled by the ways in which we would have had that conversation if we were having that exchange on Twitter in the first place. So that actually brings me to a funny story about today's guest, this guy Christian Watson, who I met on Twitter. He was saying some smart things, and it was different than the kind of stuff you usually see on Twitter, because this was a guy who struck me as not yet programmed by Twitter to speak in the way that the algorithms reward you, but to just speak in the way that I remembered people speaking in the real world, pre-Twitter, before they were reprogrammed to interact in the way that Twitter trains you to, first on Twitter and then in real life. Now, this is a guy who was talking in the way that we used to talk in real life, but still doing it on Twitter. And I don't know if that's going to earn him a lot of followers or not, but I'm not sure it much mattered. He caught my attention, and I decided to fly him to Columbus, Ohio. And Christian, here you are for the podcast. We're going to make it a joint episode of each of our podcasts.
Absolutely.
That we'll put out through our respective channels.
Absolutely.
And, I didn't get a chance to chat much beforehand because I wanted to save it for our chat here. But that's honestly what caught my attention, is you were talking like a normal person that had not been through the AI-driven reprogramming that has completely changed our discourse as human beings. And so congrats on doing that. Your picture made you look far more advanced in years than you actually are. You're like 22, dude. Yeah. So maybe you haven't had time to be reprogrammed yet.
No. But, well, unfortunately, a lot of folks in my generation now not only have been reprogrammed, they're constantly being programmed. Yeah. Right? Universities are basically molding factories for the minds of Gen Z. And unfortunately,
you graduated what, last spring?
I graduated about a year ago.
A year ago.
Yeah. And even when I was the wokeness and everything that you talk about and you so presciently point out, that has infected almost every single subject area in academia. It has infected the sensibilities of a lot of people in academia. It has affected even the temperament of people who don't even support woke ideas in academia. I'll give you an example. So I was a student leader on campus. I led a right-of-center student group on campus, which promoted free speech and free discussion, and with justification, that's the basis of a free society.
On campus
at Mercer University.
At Mercer, yep.
And one of our faculty advisors was a little bit afraid to do certain events or to put his name on certain events because he was afraid about how the faculty would perceive him.
The faculty
would perceive.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Now he hadn't had tenure yet, which may have factored into that conclusion.
But
still. Even then, that's a sign of a lack of moral conviction. And which brings me to the AI point. I think that AI has really undermined our sense of moral obligation to each other in society. So let me start off with a few premises. Every society is constituted of people interacting interpersonally, right? Ethics, how we decide which kind of behavior is right, which kind of behavior is wrong, how to conduct ourselves, happens in that interpersonal context. So already with these two premises, we've seen that it's very important that if you're going to have a proper sense of how to behave, a proper sense of moral conduct, you have to be connected interpersonally. Well, the idea behind the internet was that it was going to do that. But the problem is it removed the intimate physical context that human interaction for the past thousands of years has occurred. And over the past few decades, it has put us in this sort of disembodied place where our sense of moral obligation, our sense of respecting each other's humanity is dramatically and radically transformed.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. Let me just pause you there. So I want to parse a distinction between the internet, right, the digital world, and AI. I mean, there's a version of that without the algorithmic amplification and or effects of AI.
Right.
But what you would say is more or less true, even about just the disintermediation of human contact.
Absolutely.
And I think it's persuasive. I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
Where I think you would say something like the way we're biologically hardwired as human beings. On one hand, we're ethical and moral creatures. On the other hand, we're grounded in our constraints as human beings.
Absolutely.
That kind of need a human-to-human contact, maybe conversation
like
face-to-face like this, intermediated by nothing but particles of air between us, to really have the deepest sense of mutual respect for one another that the moral side of our humanity demands.
Precisely.
I buy that. Actually, just like immediately buy that. Like that's instantly persuasive. I think that it's the only thing I would say is like that's nothing to do with AI. Actually, that's just a feature of human beings being in a room together.
That principle, but unfortunately, that principle has been molded, or at least I think it's been really degraded by the internet.
Yep.
Not the internet itself. The internet's obviously this thing. The internet isn't anything.
Amoral
the people,
space,
the
people's use of the internet,
who have used it and who have adopted internet, sort of an internet culture, to put it in the best way I know how to put it, and have began treating their social interactions as if they
in
don't
the real
matter.
world.
Even in the real world.
That's
Exactly.
What I wonder about.
And so now I would say AI comes in.
Yeah.
Particularly with the algorithms, because there's many different facets of AI, as you know, right?
Yes.
But particularly with the algorithms, AI comes in and exemplifies. So let's do it. Let's do like a little journey here. So first we start with this basic understanding of the human need to have moral constraints, and moral constraints being present in a sort of physical, intimate contact. Then we get to the point where the internet comes in, and now we're a little bit disembodied, and the limitations are not so clear, and the way we view people are being changed because we're not as close to each other as we were in the interpersonal context. Then we get to the algorithms, the AI, that amplify the norms that we've undertaken through like in our internet interaction, and then put those in front of us all the time. So I think that, for example, the fact that Facebook, Twitter, all these social media platforms, they're really well known for using emotional things to get people to click, like using attacking dopamine receptors. I'm probably not explaining it in a very eloquent way, but triggering dopamine receptors in your brain with certain stimuli to get you to stay on their platform. Exactly. And now if you take
we all experience it.
Right, and if you take
we're human beings,
you take that and then you pair it with certain cultural norms that are developed on the internet, which can justify certain types of behavior that in person would be absolutely condemnable, whether it be insulting someone because you have an anonymous profile, whether it be, if you're of my generation, going on Xbox Live and having some kid scream at you and curse at you and yell racial slurs. All this stuff could happen in real life.
Yeah.
But it's more likely to happen on the internet because the interpersonal context that ethics require is not really as prevalent. It's not really as concrete, so to speak.
But then it's algorithmically amplified.
Yes.
Minus that, you could make a version of this argument with, and I believe people did. I mean, Leon Kass is a philosopher who back in the day made a point similar like this to the telephone.
Yeah.
Right. So the telephone was going to disintermediate human interaction in a way that would cause degradation of language, of humans' ability to connect with one another. And who knows, maybe it did have that effect to some extent, but it was one that we broadly accept was a trade-off.
Of course,
worth having made.
Yeah, and
this feels different.
Yeah, I'm certainly not a Luddite. Yeah. I certainly embrace technology. I embrace progress that happens within proper constraints, which we can talk about in a little bit if you'd like.
Within moral constraints.
Within moral constraints, absolutely. But what I don't like is when our understanding of morals and norms is shaped by this sort of amoral space, as you so put it. And then that is translated into broader society. Whereas the telephone, when it was first invented by Marty Cooper, I believe it was the man who invented the telephone, was this big brick thing, clunky. You remember, because you probably remember better than I.
We had a dial kind.
My grandmother had one of those.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and that kind of machine, you can easily differentiate it from general reality. This is a block in material, in physical space that I can use for a particular purpose. In a certain way, if you view it like that, it can actually enhance interpersonal communication interaction. And I believe it did.
It's in a separate compartment almost,
absolutely,
of your brain
but
and of your experience.
The internet is like a totalistic thing that, and for many people, encompasses a lot of their life.
It can become your second life. Of course, there was that
the game.
But in a more even colloquial sense, not Second Life the game.
Right.
Second Life game was just calling the bluff of the reality that it can indeed become your second life.
Absolutely. And when that happens, your entire perception of humanity, your entire perception of nature, which I believe is where we can understand a lot of where our moral foundations come from, your entire perception of proper human interaction is filtered through that lens. And that can lead to drastically different conclusions about the value of human beings, about certain political and social issues than would have happened without the internet. Now, that's not to say those conclusions are inherently wrong, right? Some people, due to the access of information that we have with the internet, can actually draw better conclusions, more rigorous conclusions. I mean, back in the 80s, when there was really no widespread internet usage the way there is today, you were restricted to what was in the library and what you could find, with resources. Now, at your fingertips, literally a world of knowledge is there for you to access. But when that becomes all-encompassing, and you forget, that there is a world outside of that, which a lot of people, I think, have, that's when the problem comes in. That's why I think we see a lot of, the idea of someone being terminally online, the idea of someone interpreting every single event they see in the real world through some kind of online prism. That is largely, I think, a reflection of the degradation of norms caused by an unbalanced perspective as it relates to the internet and the digital medium. And I think AI is just incidental to that. It's secondary to that.
Yeah, I think it is secondary. It's an amplifier.
Yeah.
It is what worries me about the metaverse. Because it's sort of the downward long slide.
Oh, yeah.
Telephone, okay, you've got the initial dial thing that's like a space you have to go to the house and conveniently pick up the thing with the landline to this, right, which is a big evolution.
Yeah.
Which does have a sort of a march towards the totalizing feel of dissolving the boundary between what one form of communication was versus another. But maybe we're both wrong, and 50 years from now people will be laughing at our conversation. But I would say that, but I don't think so. But I think we could say that I still feel like that doesn't have the effect of irreversibly degrading what this interaction can be. But then when you have a total all-encompassing information source, interaction source, algorithmically now amplifying the way you perceive that interaction, tilting the scales based on what gets reactions, not from you as a human being, but millions of other anonymous people by algorithms that were designed to prey on their human frailties to get them to click in ways that have a feedback effect then on you, that feels different. But then, now we go the distance to the metaverse, which the entire project, I'm not saying something that's critical or praiseworthy here. An objective description of what it aims to do is dissolve the boundary then between that internet space and the real world by creating, I like that suit you're wearing, so I click on it in the air and then I've automatically purchased it. But that algorithmic supercharging effect then kind of consummates the full loop by literally making the space between us no longer particles of air, but an internet.
Right, absolutely.
Digital
machinery. Absolutely.
Visually in the three-dimensional space between us. That is the vision of the metaverse.
Absolutely.
And that's what worries me about it, because that then becomes a one-way ratchet. Because today we can still have the sanctuary of this space, which is different than, what the nature of our interaction would be on Twitter, though maybe because you're 22, you do a great job of not yet being reprogrammed by Twitter. It is the exception rather than the rule to see someone who fits that description. But even if that became tainted, and the way I interact with somebody on Twitter, I had an exchange with Dave Rubin today, who said something, I think kind of critical of me on Twitter. We exchanged. That followed, and he was on this podcast,
Yeah, I saw that
relatively recently.
Yeah.
And then he followed that up. It was interesting because we could have just continued the exchange on Twitter. He followed that up with a text message, which had a slightly different valence to the, just the tone was just a little bit different, which would have in turn still been different than the tone had we been sitting in the same room.
Yeah.
Or even still different from the tone if we had picked up the cell phone and then called each other, which itself is then different from the tone that we have in the room. And I think that's a good thing. The fact that we have these different capabilities to turn on different modes,
Absolutely.
It's not totalizing. Now, when you add the algorithms into the social media version of that, I think that does have a mind-altering component to it that does incrementally change the way that Dave and I or you and I or whoever talk to each other offline by a little bit. Cumulatively over time changes it by a little bit times a little bit, which is a lot. But then when you actually dissolve the boundary itself and you have entered the vision of Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse, the nirvana state of the singularity of the convergence of the online and offline worlds, there's then no going back, which I think is, this isn't even I think remotely or close to a political topic here. This is just a social observation of what we otherwise assume is an inevitable trend.
Right.
The thing I struggle with sometimes, and I think that it's not the issues that I think about on the front page of my 25 commitments and my policy commitments in my presidential campaign, but it's important. It might be more important than many things that are on that top 25 list. We're in a one-way ratchet heading there right now. I'm not sure how I don't have any appetite to stop it by intervention or force. Because that doesn't seem right.
Neither do I.
That doesn't seem right. And so, for a lot of reasons. But what do we do about it? I have some thoughts, but I don't know. It sounds like you have some reactions.
Yeah, here's a maxim I always live by. Force cannot create anything, right? Force reacts to certain things, right? I think that's true in terms of physics. I think it's true in terms of government power, most certainly. So, for example, when the government applies force towards someone, well, they're not creating anything. They're just applying their power on what is already there. So the moment you try to say, I'm going to use government force to fix this thing right here in society, this general social trend, not talking about things like, that governments have legitimate interest in, like protecting rights, protecting children, which you've been very passionate about, and I agree with you entirely. I'm talking about general social trends that develop the way we interact in society. The moment the government says that we're going to put an end to this, the government is merely limiting human creativity, which will always find a way to get around that blockage. We saw it in Prohibition. When they tried to ban alcohol, guess what? The black market began to flourish.
Yes.
We've seen it with the war on drugs even. And I know that you want to go after the cartels, which is a great idea in my opinion. There are certain power interests that don't like that idea very much, but there's a great idea. But the war on drugs, the cartels are the biggest benefactors of drug prohibition. The cartel, because the moment you...
Of course they are.
Yeah, because
monopoly rent.
Exactly. The moment when
both drug industries work the same way.
There's no
profits.
Exactly. The pharmaceutical industry and the cartel is actually are pretty identical, except one has
the
more...
government create a monopoly.
Yeah, and one has more ostensibly illicit ways of doing things, even though the pharmaceutical industry buys up politicians. And so they're basically the same kind of thing. A mafia by a different style of clothing, by a different shade of green or whatever.
I agree with that. The products sold by the pharmaceutical industry, let's just be fair.
As you're a biotech. Yeah.
I share your criticism. It's an interest. It's not even a criticism. It's just a description. You have a government-created monopoly. And then you have a government-created monopoly.
Yeah.
through banning and then having an illegal sale. Here's through not banning it, but through... Actually, you do kind of ban it. You say you have to go through the FDA approval process, but the prize in the end is you get a government-enforced monopoly on the other side. we all. I mean, we've taken medicines. You've taken a Tylenol. I've taken.
Oh, yeah.
We've all taken medicines that make our lives better. So that's
of course
mostly fentanyl and opioids and other things will do. Heroin will do worse things for your body. And if used when you are sick in the right ways, a drug to treat prostate cancer or whatever can do good things for your body. But as an industry structure, there's actually some pretty striking parallels between the two industries.
Yeah. So force.
Sorry, where were you going with that?
Yeah. So force can't create anything.
Force doesn't create anything. Yeah.
Force can only really try to preserve things by stopping acts of destruction. Right. That's the entire, I think, moral incentive for government. The government ideally understood. Now, this is the ideal. This is unfortunately it's deviated from this ideal. But the government ideally understood is a structure meant to stop destruction from happening to individuals who are living peacefully and lawfully in their own capacities. Right? Governments should be based on this idea of justice. Now, this is a very important term because it's oftentimes misinterpreted in our current culture. Right? Ever since really, I want to say, and don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure the mid-20th century, our conception of the word justice has really been thrown around the ringer. So this idea of social justice, which has come to characterize and define the ethos of so many left-wing politicians and movements today, Black Lives Matter, a lot of feminist movements, you name it, March for Our Lives, the group agitating for gun control right now, Justin Pearson, Justin Jones, the Tennessee Three, all these people base their stuff on the moral foundation of social justice. But the problem with that is justice is not a behavior that happens towards a group. Social justice emphasizes the role groups play and the fates that groups supposedly have, right? But you can't quantify that. That's not really concrete, right? Justice, properly understood, and one of my favorite philosophers, Lord Keynes, he influenced Thomas Jefferson. He had a correspondence with Benjamin Franklin, actually. He has a book called Hints Concerning Education. He said in his book, Essays on the Principles of Morality and Religion, that justice is merely the principle that safeguards individuals and their property, persons, possessions, contracts, and oaths. He probably mentioned a few other things, but that's basically what it is. And so justice is a constraining force. It's meant to constrain the excesses of people, even yourself, that may affect other people. Social justice says this is no longer about constraint. This is about distribution. People may have heard the term distributive justice. That's what it's about. It's about equity, which originally meant in the time of Lord Keynes, because Lord Keynes also wrote a book called Principles on Equity. That meant pursuing justice as understood as a safeguard for rights.
Yes.
Equity in the 80s, according to the etymology that I've been able to find, immediately changed and became about the distribution of resources to so-called marginalized groups. So you have this idea of social justice coming around that same time that emphasizes collectives over individuals and therefore removes the proper domain of justice and makes it incoherent. Then you have the idea of equity, which does the same exact thing, but does it in a more concrete form. So the idea of social justice is the abstract, equity is the concrete. Social justice is the idea, equity is the how do you do it, the execution plan. And these ideas have become absorbed into our institutions so much so that they've really destroyed a lot of Americans' sense of what is just and what is not just.
It does. I mean, I think that social justice, I don't even think it has, it's a perversion of justice or anything. It has nothing to do with the justice, right? I think the fact that you have to modify, I think if you have to apply a modifier to justice, then it's not justice anymore. It's something else.
Absolutely.
It's a different project.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you gave was it Lord
Keynes, Henry Home Lord Keynes. He was a Scottish juror.
I don't know him. Yeah, you gave his definition of justice. What is your definition of justice?
So Keynes and the Enlightenment thinkers, Enlightenment natural law thinkers have had an immense influence. Jefferson, Locke, Grotius, a lot of those folks have had a immense influence on me. But I think justice is about protecting and preserving rights. That's what it has to be about if it's going to be justice at all. But there's also, it's not just that, right? There are offshoots. There are different variations of justice. I also think justice is about more informal things as well. It can be about merely keeping a promise you gave to a friend.
Yep.
That's you being just to that other person. It can be taking into consideration the lives of motorists while you're on the road, not driving recklessly. That could be you being just to other people. It could be, me right now being honest to you in what I believe in my convictions in my heart and my soul. That's me being just in a certain sense. And so I think that there is a personal sense of justice. Then there is I would say, I don't want to say the moral because that's kind of redundant, the political sense of justice, right? And the political is what I think Keynes described. I think they got it entirely right, in my opinion. And that's really the idea of justice that really America was founded upon. The founders would agree to that and everything. But the personal sense of justice is actually what is not emphasized enough in our society. And this is where, and I don't want to get us down a rabbit hole, but there's a group.
I like rabbit holes if they're good ones.
There's a group called, and maybe you've heard of them, Vivek. I'm sure I know for a fact you've acted with them. They're the post-liberals. Adrian Vermeule, I don't want to call anyone out, but just
like for example.
For example, Adrian Vermeule, Josh Hammer, Yoram Hazony, Paul Gottfried, all these different kinds of people, these different thinkers and intellectuals. They've come together and they've concluded something that I think is rather concerning. And these are all, by the way, very smart people. Not insulting them. I think their ideas are fatally flawed in many cases. And I talked to Yoram Hazony, who's one of the most brilliant political philosophers of our era, but I think he's wrong in many cases. They've concluded that the degradation happening in society, which reflects a lack of personal values, I just mentioned personal justice, is a failure of classical liberalism. It's a failure of Enlightenment-era liberalism. That's what they've concluded. And they have then therefore prescribed in many cases to return away from this emphasis on the individual that is inherent to the American founding to an emphasis on the common good.
Yes.
This idea that what is good for the whole has to be good for the few. Now, that's obviously a very gross simplification, but the common good tries to collectivize the idea of good into what a group or community might think. Now, we
should have competing visions, as they would say, people in the school, of what that common good is.
Yeah, exactly. Some people have it in a more Aristotelian fashion.
But it's not a pluralistic project, an individualistic project.
No.
It is, there's a correct vision and there's a wrong vision, and this is going to be the correct vision, and everyone should live by it.
Absolutely, and they even fight amongst themselves, because amongst the post-liberals, you have the integralists, who are the Catholics, who want to impose their sort of Thomistic Aquinas idea of common good on people.
There's like Sohrab Ahmari, who I've spoken to.
Ahmari, I believe that I think Vermeule is a very strong.
I think Sohrab Ahmari.
Vermeule is a very strong Catholic. He's a very strong Catholic. Yeah. And I'll say this. I talk about natural law all the time. The Catholics did a very good job in developing natural law.
Oh, yeah.
I think the Enlightenment just took it to a different level, though.
It did, yeah. but actually, you got to give a credit to even the likes of even the Saint Ignatius types.
Absolutely.
Saint Aquinas types. Yeah,
absolutely.
Saint Thomas Aquinas types.
Oh yeah.
Who
I
laid
think
the foundation for that. Absolutely.
Thomas Aquinas is one of the most revolutionary political thinkers in all of history, in my opinion.
Yeah, but nonetheless, the Enlightenment thinkers completed that project that he set in motion.
The Enlightenment just took it to a very different direction, and they completed it, and the culmination of that was America. Because at the beginning of the Enlightenment, you get Francisco Suarez, who was a Spanish scholastic philosopher, who was one of the first, it's disputed, but it's one of the first really to develop this idea of individual rights. He used this word called ius, I-U-S, a Latin word, which meant roughly things that belong to you, qualities that belong to your person. And he took that to mean rights. Hugo Grotius, who was a Dutch jurist, who I did my thesis on in college, actually, who influenced Locke immensely, who the founders read him. They read his works, and he's considered one of the more premier thinkers in international law. He took Suarez's idea and translated it for a sort of Enlightenment audience, and tied to it the principle of what we call sociability. Man is a social animal, and his need to preserve social relations means that there has to be constraints on behavior. Those constraints are rights. Then Locke takes this, and he just completely destroys the monarchy. He destroys paternalism. He destroys the divine right of kings, and he establishes a clear political project, which our founders then take in many parts and implement here in America. So there's a direct link, no matter what. And some post-liberal thinkers will say, hey, that link doesn't exist. There's a direct link between the Enlightenment and the formation of America. Without the Enlightenment, I don't think you really get America how it is today. And that is something that I think the post-liberals overlook. Another thing, so the common good can't be accounted for. I really don't know how to measure that. It's not really concrete. I think that good is ultimately a matter of taste or preference. And in philosophy, I'm sure you know, there's this conflict between the good and the right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of ethical debates come down on those lines.
Do you believe in the vision of the good, or do you believe in the right?
Yeah,
I mean, kind of roughly speaking,
yeah,
the procedural justice versus end state.
Yeah, and this is where, yes, that's brilliant. Yeah. Yes, because
I mean, just make it a little more practical
right,
for people.
Absolutely,
here. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, right. So, do you believe that you should live a good life by pursuing certain ideas that may help you flourish as a human being, and let that be the basis of your ethical life? Or do you just follow these rules that are laid out, written in the stars or in nature in the heart, whatever you want to say, and you do that to be a moral person? I heavily sympathize with the right. Because I'm what they call a deontologist. For those who don't know, I'm someone who believes that there are certain objective norms and principles that we have to follow in order to have good moral behavior. Having said that, there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's essential, and our founders knew this, to adopt parts of the good and incorporate it into our own lives.
Into our own lives, yeah.
The post-liberals fail by trying to place the good in the community. Trying to place the good in the community. The good matters.
And this is what John Adams said.
Yeah.
Right? The Constitution was made for a moral people.
Right.
But that's in the way that we live our lives individually. So here's I think let me give them, I think, credit for what they're onto and can productively add to I think what was at a certain point a hollowness that began to form, I think, in people's reaction to the values of classical liberalism. Mm-hmm. And is that a failure of classical liberalism? Maybe not. Maybe it is. But practically applying it to the world, if people feel a sense of hollowness or betrayal, then it's functionally not going to work. Right. So I think that, and I've talked about this a lot in the presidential campaign in the national identity context, to say that we're hungry for purpose and meaning and identity at a moment in our history when the things that used to fill that void have disappeared. If we can fill that void with something more meaningful, then we can begin the process of an American revival. Mm-hmm. Here's what I'll say. I think that you and I are cut from very similar cloths. That's probably why I was drawn to your way of thinking. I'm sort of a deontologist as well. Whatever tradition we can put that in. However, I will admit this much. I think that the proceduralism of classical liberalism, right? Like free speech, equal treatment under the law, like 14th Amendment, Bill of Rights type of stuff as well. There's not enough grit and substance for people in a moment when we're lacking in purpose and meaning to quite fill our heart with that. It's like we're grasping at something,
absolutely,
but it's not. We're not able to wrap our hands around it. It's the nature of what it is. It's not sort of teleological destination. There's our teleological worldview. It's not a destination of the good.
Right.
We lack the good or a vision of the good in the way we live our lives individually through faith in God or whatever. Yeah. And so we want to fill it with something else. And classical liberalism just ain't doing the trick for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that this is why I've tried to frame some of what I've brought to this campaign and a cultural movement before the campaign in terms of the pursuit of excellence.
Absolutely.
Where I think excellence, we can talk about what that means, but it's in some ways has the qualities of a destination that is almost the inevitable destination of the values of classical liberalism, right? Free speech, open debate, plurality of thought, diversity, whatever it is.
I hope it is.
You would hope it is. And so that gives people at least something to wrap their arms around. I can wrap my arms around excellence.
We can, yeah.
I can't wrap my arms around proceduralism, and to sort of you substitute for this alternative weird, I don't want to say weird, sorry, this alternative strain of the conservative movement now that's going to, no, by dogma, we are going to institute the right way to live, and it is this.
Yeah.
The thing they're onto is that proceduralism, the proceduralism of classical liberalism didn't fill the vacuum in the heart, so they're going to try to fill it with fill in the blank Catholic value, whatever else value instead, when in fact that's for the space in our individual lives to then embrace in the way we live our civic life through the proceduralism of what's enshrined in the Constitution, which is really the backdrop of Enlightenment values. Do you follow what I'm saying there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think there are a few things I want to go off of there.
Yeah.
This is actually a very good point, because James Lindsay, I think he tweeted something yesterday there was an article written in a major publication, like a major academic publication, that said that wokeism did not come from Marxism; it came from the failures of liberalism. And James was like, no, it didn't. And a lot of people were just jumping on him and attacking him. Da, 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 da. And so I made a tweet saying that the general post-liberal argument here is a category error, as you mentioned, because in ethics we have this idea, and I'm going to use jargon for a second, then I'm going to explain a thin versus thick conception of morality. So a thin conception of morality is essentially the baseline rules and principles that we have to abide by to be moral people. So don't steal, don't cheat, don't take other people's stuff, be honorable in your contracts.
Yep.
Things like that. That's the thin conception, and classical liberalism provides all of that. But the thick conception is what we would call the values that go beyond that baseline, that expand beyond that baseline, the broader worldview, the richer worldview. And you're correct, classical liberalism can't provide for that because it's not meant to provide for that. Classical liberalism is meant to be a set of principles applied to political processes.
It's putting too much on the shoulders of classical liberalism. It was never trying to be
It's meant to be applied to political processes.
Yes.
But
political processes aren't everything.
Yeah, that's the problem. Ever since, really, I want to say before the 60s, but it culminated in the 60s when second wave feminism came around. Instead of arguing for equal rights for women, they were saying the personal is political. The moment the personal becomes political is the moment the government gets to go into society and erode it according to its whims.
And in a certain way, this is the groundwork for this is in some ways laid, just to give the positive spin on this, is America was so darn good at instantiating the values of classical liberalism, the Enlightenment values, that it started to lend itself to be the subject of a civic religion. Not a religion of God, but a civic religion. But it was like so good that it became tempting for us to see that as doing more than the Enlightenment values or classical liberalism ever promised or could ever do. And so we started to make that mistake and kind of conflate it when, in fact, we go back to the fact that no, the Constitution isn't everything. It was made against the backdrop of a moral people. That morality is not supposed to be enshrined in the Constitution. The Constitution is enshrining a vision of Enlightenment values against the backdrop of a society that has more to it than the political values enshrined in that system. And I think drawing that distinction, I think, is valuable.
Right. And classical liberalism has built in this distinction between the public and the private. Right. The public sphere is the sphere of government. That's where the government does all its activities, lawmaking, that kind of stuff. The private sphere is your family life. It's you going out to the store, you buying something on Amazon, you raising a kid, whatever you do.
Totally.
But the two have become so blurred by intention, by design. For some people, like the post-liberals, I don't think there is that distinction, really. Or at least it's very emasculated.
And this blurring of distinctions and lines, there's a deeper point here where, like, even what we were talking about at the very beginning, the blurring of the lines. I think we live in a moment that entices us to want to blur boundaries between things that were designed to be kept apart. And I think this is the vision of the Great Reset.
Oh, yes.
The Great Reset is about dissolving the boundaries between the public sector and the private sector, between nations. I mean, there's something to be said of national identity.
Absolutely.
There's such a thing as Italian identity and such a thing as American identity and such a thing as German identity. And dissolving the boundaries between each leaves us with the version of neither that leaves us a gamish of something else altogether to take its place. The same thing with respect to the boundaries between even what you would say procedural fairness style values enshrined in Enlightenment values in our Constitution, different from the substantive moral convictions and faiths in God that we embrace in the private sphere of our moral lives. And I think that we live in this movement, in this moment that tempts us in so many ways to blur the boundaries, the distinctions that give us the possibility of integrity in the different spheres of our lives.
It's the forbidden
itself.
fruit.
And I think it is. It's
so tempting.
Sort of the dissolution
it's so tempting to ignore distinctions, because what are distinctions are products of man's ability to reason.
To discern.
To reason, whatever word you want to read. And man's ability to reason is unique to him. There's no other animal on this planet that can reason the way we do. Now, you can say animals have different levels of understanding or whatever, but not like humans.
This is what distinguishes us.
Not like human beings. We're a higher sort of animal, as the natural author has understood, and as empirical evidence has bared out. We've built civilization because of our ability to reason, to process things. But I think our politics, at least the way many of us view our politics, kind of puts reason to the side and puts emotional sensibilities and preferences to the front. So, for example, when a post-liberal says that society is, degrading and there's a destruction of basic ideas, basic truths, and liberalism can't account for that. Well, it's not, to them, the distinction need not be made because the political is so intertwined with the community. This going all the way back to, I don't want to get too nerdy, but all the way back to Aristotle. Mm-hmm. You can't be virtuous by yourself. You need the polity. Mm-hmm. You need the community.
And the household, by the way.
Right, in the household.
The individual, the household,
yeah,
and
you
the
need.
broader
That's
polity.
what Aristotle said. Yeah. And so if you take that seriously, well, the community has an interest in what you do in your life in almost every aspect, because virtue is an all-encompassing feature, and they have an influence in that. They have a say in that.
Yeah.
And so I see where the post-liberals are coming from.
Oh, I do, absolutely.
I see, but it's just not.
And they've added something useful to the conversation.
Yeah, but it's just not the vision we need to embrace.
I'm with you on that.
We need to be strong on a bedrock of proceduralism while emphasizing, as you mentioned, how to fill that God-shaped hole in our hearts. You mention that all the time. Mm-hmm. I love it. It's brilliant. How do you fill it? Well, I think that we're seeing secularism creep up in America.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of people get away from God.
I'm Vivek Ramaswamy, candidate for president, and I approve this message.
Paid for by Vivek 2024.